This is the second video in which we're looking at the question of socialism and capitalism in the Mosiac Law. In the first video, we talked about how the law largely affirms private property and the free market, but at the same time makes provision for taking care of the poor. In this video, we're going to talk about the law's treatment of the land of Israel. And once again, we'll see that it largely affirms private property in the free market, but it makes some pretty big exceptions in there for one particular factor of production, which is the land itself. The Lord spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land that I give you, the land shall keep a Sabbath to the Lord. For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap what grows of itself in your harvest, or gather the grapes of your undressed vine. It shall be a year of solemn rest for the land. The Sabbath of the land shall provide food for you, for yourself and for your male and female slaves, and for your hired worker and the sojourner who lives with you, and for your cattle and for the wild animals that are in your land. All its yield shall be for food." So there's almost a personification of the land happening here, where the land is seen as similar to a brother Israelite, really, that you cannot just enslave the land and work it mercilessly year after year after year. You have to allow it to rest. The main point here is that in some sense the land was special. Just because you owned a plot of land didn't give you 100% authority and freedom to do whatever you wanted to with that land. And as we continue to read in Deuteronomy 25, we'll see that there were even bigger provisions that made the land extra special, where it's not fully your private property. In some sense, it's really God's property. And he even says that explicitly at one point. So let's continue reading. "You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that at the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Okay, that kind of sounds complicated. Why doesn't he just say 49 years, right? Well, there's a certain symbolism and significance to the number 7. So 7 times 7 is really significant. And so this 50th year would be special in some way. So on the Day of Atonement, which is the most significant day in the Jewish calendar, that begins the 50th year. You proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. The 50th year, you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself." So the 50th year is kind of like one of the 7th years. But you may eat the produce of the field. Okay, you can still eat what comes out, but don't reap. So a different way of harvesting. "Now in this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property." So this Jubilee law was an even bigger limit on private ownership of the land. Instead of the land being an asset that could be traded around amongst anyone you wanted. If I'm the owner of that asset, I can choose who to sell it to, and that's fully my decision, or I can hold on to it and I can continue to farm it year after year. So I have this 7th year I can't farm it. Okay, that's one limitation. But the much bigger limitation is that in the 50th year, if that land was not my family's land, so if it wasn't passed down to me from my father and grandfather, then that land goes back to the family who originally owned it. In other words, when Joshua led Israel into the promised land, and each tribe, the land was divided up amongst the 12 tribes, and that was their inheritance. And then within the tribe, individual families were given certain parcels of land. So ever since that time when Joshua entered and divided up the land, it was to remain with that family for generations and generations. And so we're not, if I own that land but it wasn't passed down to me, it's really another family's land, I'm not really the owner of it. I'm just sort of leasing it or renting it from them until the next Jubilee year. And the next part of the passage makes that really explicit. So let's continue reading. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price, and if the years are few, you shall reduce the price, for it is the number of crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am the Lord your God. So while these statements are very different from what we would usually consider an affirmation of private property, right? These are really strict limits on how you can use what's supposedly your property. These statements are still very much affirming the free market, and having reasonable valuations for what you're buying and selling in that market. It's just that the land doesn't fit most of the normal conditions of private property. It says very explicitly here in the law, when you make a sale of land to your neighbor, calculate the market value. Make that sale according to the market value of when that land will return to the neighbor. Now, one quick aside here, if you read on into the historical books, you'll see that Israel almost never, I don't know if they ever obeyed the Jubilee year. I don't think it really makes clear. I can't remember any time when it says explicitly that they, followed the Jubilee and released the land. So continuing on, just the very next part, it says, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess you shall allow a redemption of the land. Okay, so this is, emphasizing what we already saw just earlier in the passage. But it kind of gives a reasoning behind this now. It says, you are strangers and sojourners with me. It says that God is the owner of the land and that no human being is really owning it. They're just using what is God's. The land is not really yours. You're living there with my blessing, and I'm the ultimate owner of it. And then if we skip down a little bit, in the Jubilee the land shall be released, and he shall return to his property. At the bottom, there's some more provisions here that explain, okay, there's different conditions for if you're selling a town or if you're selling a house in a city versus selling land, and also different rules for Levites because they had, special exceptions for their houses and for their land. Now this section right here is talking about the kinsman redeemer law. So this was a special law that allowed someone who is a relative of the person selling the land, they can come in and buy it back. And they have the legal right to buy it back even before the year of Jubilee. So this is yet another limitation on, sort of the ownership rights of the land when it's sold from family to family. Okay, so if I buy your land for the next 30 years until the Jubilee, I'm buying that, number of crops that I can get until then. But in addition, that contract has a special provision where if your family wants to buy it back from me, you can basically, it's basically prorated where, say 10 years later you want to buy it back, and so there's 20 years left of our original contract. Well, 20 out of 30 years is 2/3, right? So you can buy it back from me for presumably 2/3 of the original price that we negotiated. And once again, this provision is just another protection in there for the poorer person who has the need to sell their land. This kinsman redeemer law is actually a really interesting provision. It comes into play in the book of Ruth. So Boaz ends up being a kinsman redeemer for Ruth's husband's family, for Ruth and Naomi themselves. And that whole story, the way Boaz is the kinsman redeemer, is actually prefiguring Jesus and the things he does for us, the way he redeems us. If you're interested in learning more about this kinsman redeemer law, I have a video all about it right here.